check. Okay. So if everybody could go to our week 10 files, I think. Let me go check really quick. And no, it's going to be actually in week 9. Yeah, in week 9, there's a folder called Puppet Warp. If you could open that folder. And yeah, there's a just a puppet warp figure.psd. If you could go ahead and launch that. Was everybody able to find that guy? Okay. When this opens up, you'll notice here, if you take a look at the layers stack right here, there's a lot in here. There's a lot of things that are controlling her skin. There's I don't know. It's a mess in here if you want to know the truth. I just want to clean this up really quickly. So to do that, I'm going to collapse the figure. I'm going to turn off the background, so it should be basically just the person on a transparent background, and then I'm going to go up to the very top and click on the figure, and then again I'm going to do a merge stamp version of everything to get this onto a transparent layer. So Command, Option, Shift, and the letter E will do a merge stamp version that's on the top. Turn off the figure group. We don't need to see that anymore. And then I need to get rid of the 2 little bits of floor that are still on here. So hit the L key to get the lasso tool and select one of them, and hit the delete key and the lasso tool and select the other one and hit the delete key. And basically now you've simply got this figure on a transparent background, which is what I want. And at this stage of the game, I'm going to turn this into a smart object because we're going to talk about puppet warping right now, and puppet warp is a transform. It's related to liquefy. In my case, though, in my feeling, it's well, it's different tools for different reasons. So at any rate, I'm going to change this into sure. So collapse the figure group. Turn off the background. The background is white, so at the very bottom, turn it off. You should see a girl on a checkerboard. Select the figure group, hold down the Command key, the Option key, the Shift key, and hit the letter E. And it does a merge. That keyboard shortcut is a merge stamp version of everything that is visible. So because the white background was not turned on and not visible, it does not become a part of this. If it was turned on, it would actually be part of this. Make sense? Okay, hit the L key to get the lasso tool and circle the 2 hunks of floor that are still showing. We just need to get rid of those. And then turn off the figure group because otherwise they'll still show. And hit Command D to deselect. And then finally convert this girl by herself to a smart object. So up to the layer menu, down to smart objects, and convert to smart object. Again, we want her to be a smart object because liquefy it's a transform, but if you do it on a smart object, it's infinitely changeable and non-destructive. All right, so everybody's got this much, right? Okay, so to get to Puppet Warp, it's come up to the Edit menu and come down to Puppet Warp. It's really close to where all the transform parts are. Click on Puppet Warp, and when you do that, depending on how you've got your options set up, you will either see this girl looks like she's covered in a spider web or not. If you do not see the spider web part on here, look up at your options menu and click on the thing, the little check mark right next to where it says Show Mesh. And the reason this part is important for a number of reasons. First off is the way Puppet Warp actually works. So if you do imagine this is like a spider web, unlike liquefy, in Puppet Warp, everything is connected. So if you move something and another part of the image is not anchored down, it will move the entire image. You'll see what I'm talking about in just a second. But the way to imagine this really is that this figure is trapped inside this web, and that you can freeze parts of the web and move other parts of the web relative to it to do these transforms. But realize that all of these lines are interconnected. So you might be moving something up by her face, part of her nose, and actually her toes will actually move as well. So it's just something to be aware of here. Again, you'll see what I mean when we sort of start actually doing the work on here. The other thing that you need to know about this is this. There are modes up here at the top. If you click on the first of the modes, so I just want to go through the options really fast. If you click on the drop-down menu, you actually have 3 different modes here: rigid, normal, and distort. Unless you were trying to do more like cartoon work, you would leave it on normal. Distort does very strange things to this. It's like using the really weird shit in Liquify, the pucker tool to an extreme, that kind of stuff. We can take a look at it. But at any rate, you want to make sure that these things are set up correctly before you start doing your puppet warp, because if you do the puppet warp and then you have to change these, it will actually change your puppet warping. So all the stuff that you thought you were doing correctly will radically change. So at any rate, 99.999%, I'm going to go out on a limb and say 100% of the work that I've ever done in here, I've always left the mode as normal. In terms of the density, and this matters too, you want to set this first. If you take a look in the drop-down menu, you can see you have fewer points. If you click on that, you'll see that there are fewer lines and there are fewer intersections of those lines on the mesh. If you go to normal, this is where it comes on when you first launch it, and then if you go to more points, you get a much finer mesh. The thing about this is that the finer mesh gives you greater control, but this is a very process-intensive thing. So if you've got a relatively powerful computer, you'll be fine. If you've got a 7-year-old Windows machine that is barely creeping along, you maybe do not want to use more points in here because it will take forever for the puppet warp to actually render. If you've got a relatively new machine, my suggestion is to always use more points. But this too matters, because if you start out at normal and we start doing some puppet warp, placing work and moving stuff around, and you then change it from normal to more points because you need finer control, the entire image can completely shift. Everything that you've done can move. So you don't want to start, you need to start where you're going to actually be. In my case, I always go to more points here. I've got a relatively fast computer. I'm going to suggest you guys do the same thing, but if you find that, oh my God, I tried to move something and 5 minutes later, then finally the hand moved, you definitely need to go to working with fewer points. The expansion, if you actually zoom into this girl, you'll actually see that this mesh goes beyond her body. It continues here outside of her body. So it's not just that her body is surrounded in this mesh, it's part of the space around that. That's what this expansion is about. The default is 2 pixels. It's always worked for me. You can actually extend this. You can actually do it to more pixels. There's no reason to do that if you're doing knockout work like this. If you go to fewer, if you go to like 0 pixels, it will actually come in. But the problem then is that when you do your warping, it will actually leave the edge of the image. The edge of the image will not warp like the rest of the image. So this is sort of like this safety extension around it. The expansion, the 2 pixels, has always worked for me. I personally hate the mesh, so I don't show the mesh. So I'm actually going to click on this to turn it off. You don't need it to be on. Even though there are intersections right here, you can put points anywhere on this image. You do not need to only put them here on intersections. You can put them anywhere. We will talk about pin depth later. Finally, the little 3 icons that are up here at the very top. The first one, the arrow that's actually circling back counterclockwise, will remove all of the pins but not take you out of Puppet Warp. We are in sort of a special Photoshop space. So it will get rid of the pins, anything that you've put down, but you'll stay inside of Puppet Warp, and you can actually start repinning right away. If you click on the circle with the slash through it, it will actually simply take you out of Puppet Warp without doing any of the warping. And then finally, the check mark will actually apply the warping and then also take you out of the space back into the normal Photoshop. Now, because we are working as a smart object, Puppet Warp is a smart filter, so whatever you do on here, it will be saved. You can always go back in here and you can refine it, and we can just simply, anyway, let's actually start to do some Puppet Warp. Again, I'm going to turn off my mesh. It always bothers me. I don't really like the way it looks. And we're going to start by pinning. So let me zoom back out just a little bit. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm simply going to hover over her elbow on her left arm, and I'm going to, you have a cursor that is black, right? It's the black arrow at arrow. But if you click once on it, you will actually see that it puts down, well, let me ask you this. How many people, anybody in this room familiar with Puppet Warp? Do a lot of work in Puppet Warp? It's pretty new for everybody else, though? Okay, that's fine. Anyway, it puts down a pin. And this is truly a metaphor of a pin. If you actually now hover your cursor over this guy again, I'm not clicking on it, but hover over it again, you'll see that your cursor actually changed to something that looks like a push pin. And this is actually a good metaphor for this. So what I have just done is I have anchored her elbow to this transparent background. So imagine this just like it's like some sort of artboard. And I've really just pushed a push pin through on her elbow right there. And that part is now not able to move. However, if you then come down and you click on, I'm going to come down to her wrist of the same arm, and I'm going to actually put down another pin. And you'll see in this case that the first pin used to have a blue dot in the center. It's no longer blue. And the second pin now actually does have a blue dot in it. And that blue dot indicates that it has been selected. If you actually then hover over that blue pin and click and drag counterclockwise, you will actually see what I meant by this entire thing. The entire image is rotating around that pin that has been stuck into the board at her elbow. But because she is entirely meshed into this, everything moves. Her feet move, her head moves, her other arm moves, her whole body is rotating around this because, again, the only thing that has been pinned in place is that elbow part. Does that make sense to everyone? If you come up to the, again, the little three icons that are on the top on the right-hand side, the counterclockwise arrow, and click on it, it will actually remove all the pins, and your image will go back to the way it was before. At this stage of the game, though, I don't want her, I don't want to rotate her. I actually want to bend her elbow. So this is how you do it. We're going to click the same place. I'm going to put a pin right about where I imagine her elbow would actually bend. But now we need to pin the rest of her body down so that it does not move. Now I'm going to click a pin right here at her top shoulder, her left shoulder. I'm going to do another one on her right shoulder. And then I'm going to come back again and I'm going to grab this part by her wrist down here at the bottom. So the wrist down at the bottom, I'm going to click and I'm going to do that same counterclockwise move. And what you'll notice is I get a whole lot more rotation in her arm. I don't get any rotation in her shoulders, but her feet are still moving. This is what I was telling you about. That interconnected web is still causing anything that's not completely pinned down to actually move. So if you do not want her feet to move, you've got to pin those down as well. So I am going to hit Command Z to undo that, which will actually take me back. And then I'm going to pin the rest of her body. So I'm going to start by throwing a pin in her opposite wrist and something about where her elbow would be. I'm going to drop pins across her waist. I typically will do 3 of those. Now at this stage of the game, she's probably pretty well anchored. You can try again. I'm going to click and move her wrist again, and you can see that you don't get really any well, we're getting a little motion in her knees. So I'm going to hit Command Z to undo that. And I'm going to pin the bottom of the skirt, her knees, and then I'm also going to throw a pin at her ankle and another one at her toes. So now I know for certain she's pinned down really well. I'm also going to put a pin right in the middle of her forehead. So now I can actually bend this elbow. So I'm going to click on the point that is at her wrist, and I'm going to drag this in. And what you'll notice is you start to drag it in. I'm going to keep bringing this in pretty seriously. You will notice that her hand has actually gone behind her skirt. You'll also notice that there's a very small little white line. If you zoom in on this, you'll see that there's a small little white line that separates, it looks like a division between her hand and the skirt. That's actually the expansion that we've got going. Do not worry about that. If we go ahead and actually apply this puppet warp, that will go away and her hand will actually be behind her skirt. However, for me, her arm looks like it's curving. Her arm is not, it's not a bend in it, it's more of a curve in that. You can continue to add pins and actually move that. So I'm going to put another pin in basically what would be the middle of her forearm. I'm going to put one right between her elbow and that wrist. I'm going to click there. Again, it becomes the hot pin, the blue pin, and now I can actually push this in. But you'll notice when I push this in, because her fingertips are not pinned, again, they are actually moving. So if I want her fingers to stay where they were, I actually have to pin her fingers in place. But in my case, I'm okay with this part. I'm just going to actually change this in so that it actually looks like a more natural bend in her arm. We might also take a little more bend out of the between her elbow and her shoulder. I'm going to put another pin there and actually pull this in just a little bit as well. So it just doesn't look so curvy to me. And this actually looks like a better shape for me. Let me zoom back out so that you guys can see. And so I'm going to say, okay, I like this. So I'm going to go ahead and commit it. And I'm going to click on the check mark and it actually does it. And now if you zoom into that area, you can see that her hand actually is behind her skirt. And we don't have that little white line in there anymore. And this actually looks pretty good. However, I work for, you know, have I ever told you my definition of art director or what I do for a living? As a photographer, what I do for a living is I take a three-dimensional object and render it as a two-dimensional object for a one-dimensional person. Okay. I need to change this. I'm going to double click on Puppet Warp again to go right back into it. So click again on the Smart Filter, and you'll see as I come right back in here that I actually get all the pins are still in place. I can add pins, I can take pins away. I want to move her hand though on top of the skirt, and to do that, that's pin depth. So if you select the pin that is closest to her hand, what we need to do, or what you need to remember is that the way we did this in order is that we started with the pin that was at her elbow, and then we added the pin that was here at her wrist, and then we started adding the pins that are all on her body. As we're adding those pins on her body, they are actually in pin depth definition on top of the ones that we did in the very beginning. And that's why the hand is now behind the skirt. But we can change the pin depth. We can actually bring it up on top of this. And that's what pin depth right here is about. And you'll see that next to pin depth there is two little icons. One of them is supposed to look like a stack with an arrow pointing up. That will actually raise the pin depth up. You don't just click on this once. Sometimes you have to click on it multiple times depending on your pin order. And then the other one, which is again another stack of pins with the arrow pointing down, will actually push this back into space. So if we want to bring this in front of her skirt, simply select the one pin that actually is defined this to begin with, and then we're going to click the first of the icons that's got the arrow that points up. And you see when that happens, it actually puts her hand now on top of the skirt. You still have that expansion sort of border that's around this, but now when I click OK for this guy, it actually puts it in the front of her skirt right now. And you cannot imagine how powerful a tool this thing actually is. Why? Again, you won't see this on the video, but you will hear it. So you're doing your composite. Again, I'm your composite, and this is the space that you just put me into, and here I am sitting in the classroom. And you get the shadows right, and you get the lighting right, and you get the contrast right, and you get the color and the saturation right, and all the kind of things, whatever. And the comp will look relatively successful, but it will never have the illusion of, again, taking a background element and making it a foreground element, or making it something in front of the subject. And what I mean by that is that if I'm just standing here like this, I'm not really integrated in the scene. I'm floating in this. But if I do this, I'm integrated into this scene. There is now an element that's in my background that is now in front of me, that I'm interacting with, all of those kind of things. You can take a body that's like this and do this with Puppet Warp. It's insane. But those are the small little things. You can actually twist a hand. You can actually do something like this. You can lift a foot. You can actually, in all of the, we haven't done tons of comps, but the girl that's on the rocks, you can actually change the pitch of her feet. You can actually bring her heels up and her heels down. Those sorts of things. That's all what puppet warping is about. Does that make sense? So I tell everybody this. I know a lot of you guys in here, not all, but a lot of you guys are fashion shooters. There isn't a fashion shot that is from one of any of the big companies. So again, all the big designers, anybody like that, there's not one image from those group, from the Prada group, for the Marc Jacobs, whoever, Armani, all of them. There's not a single image of theirs that you have seen that they have not stretched the people who are in them, girls and guys. They are all stretched. I'm just telling you that. It's just a fact of life. And you do it using Puppet Warp. It's not the only way to do it. It's the only good way to do it. So I'm going to show you basically how you do those sorts of things here in Photoshop as well. Because again, we had the conversation when we were talking about ethics and body modification. What I will say in this is that this is just, it's the arena that you're playing in. Now, you can choose to ignore that or deny that or fight that or object to that or whatever you can choose to do, whatever. I'm merely stating what happens in that arena right now, and then you get to decide how you want to play. Does that sort of make sense? Okay, so at any rate, how to stretch this person. So again, double click on Puppet Warp. You can go right back into it. I'm going to double click on the hand. Oops, sorry. Okay, so at this stage of the game, two things when you talk about or think about that they actually do a lot with models is the first thing is to actually stretch necks. Longer neck, again, something that people go for is an indicator of height. So we're going to stretch her neck to begin with. So to do that, I'm going to zoom into her head. And the trick about doing this part is that we need to freeze everything except for her neck. And what I mean by that is, well, you'll see. We're going to actually do it right now. I'm going to add another set of pinpoints, and I'm going to do it pretty much around coming through like her collarbone. So I'm going to set a point here at her shoulder. I'm going to put another one here, another one sort of in the middle of her neck, another one here, another one here, and another one here. So I've sort of surrounded the bottom part of her neck. If I actually now put a point at her chin is going to be the only thing that actually moves. Again, her forehead has got a pin in it, and all of the lower body has got pins in it as well. If I click on the pin on her chin and push up, you can see it crushes her face because her forehead has actually been pinned as well. So the trick to doing this is that you really need to isolate the area that you want to actually move by freezing everything else. I'm going to hit Command Z to undo that, and instead I'm going to start working my way around the perimeter of her face. I'm putting pins along her jawline, in her ears. You need to add her hair to this as well, because otherwise you will compress her hair or it won't move at all, including the little curl that's all the way out on the edge. Again, if you were using normal or fewer points, you probably would not be able to get those out on the edge. But I'm going to come back in on all of this. Again, I'm hitting her ears and the rest of her face here. And you would think that this would be enough. It's actually not enough. You need to really worry about distorting features. So I'm going to pin both sides of her mouth. And in this case, you'll see I get this warning, and it says, we can't add another pin here because it's too close to another existing pin. It doesn't like something that's down in this area. If I was doing normal number of pins instead of more, I would have gotten this message a long time ago. So I'm simply going to say, okay, fine, and I'm going to set a pin a little bit higher. It won't let me do it there. A little bit higher still. Onto her cheek. I'm going to try to get one on the center of her nose. It's not going to let me do that. I'll try the bridge of her nose. I'm going to try both of her eyes. And then I'm also going to try her forehead a little bit more. Again, the reason I'm doing this pinning, typically you would think you would be able to simply do the outline, but I'm doing this pinning because I don't want anything to change within her face. Again, it's that whole mesh that's surrounding this that these become a real problem. So now I need to select all of these guys to move her head up in one move. So to do that, select the first pin that's actually at her chin, hold down the Shift key, and start clicking on all the other pins, and you will see that they are all turning blue. This blue indicates that we can move them as a group, and you would think that there would be an easier way to select all of these, and if there is, I don't think you can drag across. Yeah, you can't drag across these. That would be great if you could. But at any rate, I'm still holding down the Shift key, selecting all the other pins. And everybody is selected now. At this case, you can, and at this point, you can let go of the Shift key, and it doesn't matter which one you select. They will all do the same thing. I'm just going to select the one on her forehead. I'm going to click and drag up, and you can see that you are stretching her neck out. Do not be deceived. Do not, like, all of a sudden, like, yank her neck up till she looks like, you know, an alien. These subtle moves in this, because subtle moves make a huge difference in doing all of this part. So I've just raised her neck up just a little bit here, and then I'm going to go ahead and say OK to that. And if we go, now the puppet warp has actually been done. If you go Command Z to go back and forth, you'll actually see how much you've actually lifted her neck. And the truth of it is, in the real world, we just added an inch to her neck, which is a massive move. Okay. I'm not done yet, so I'm going to go back into Puppet Warp, and all of my pins are still selected. That's not the part that I'm interested in working with now. The part that I'm interested in working with now is actually going to be stretching out her legs. I'm going to make her a little bit longer. She has a relatively long waist already, so I'm not going to put more length into that, but I am going to put more into her thighs and also into her lower legs. So to do the pinning part for her thighs, what I'm going to do is, again, I'm going to come down. I'm going to add one more pin right sort of where the skirt is beginning to touch her leg. So I've got sort of 3 along the bottom, and I'm going to zoom into this area right here, and I'm going to select the 3 along the bottom. So I'm going to click the first one on the back of the hem, hold down the Shift key, select the next one, then the ones up by her knees. Now at this stage of the game, if I don't select the pins that are at her shoes, well, here, you can just see what happens. I'm going to click again on the one that's in the center, and I'm going to drag in the direction that I need to make her thighs a little bit longer. But you see what happens is that because her feet are pinned, it actually makes her legs shorter. So I'm going to hit Command Z to undo that. I'm going to hold down the Shift key, and I'm going to add her shoes to this so that all of her legs move down. And then again, I'm going to click on that same pin, and I'm going to drag down to make her thighs just a little bit longer. And then finally, I'm actually going to make her feet, her legs, the shin part of her legs, longer as well. To do that, we need to deselect any of these pins. So I'm simply going to select a different pin. I'm going to select something like on her wrist. That turns it blue, everybody else gets deselected, and now I can come down and simply click on the pin that's at her ankle and the one that is at her toe, and then drag those down. Actually, not drag those down. Command Z to undo that. Click on the one that, Shift key. And then click on the one that is at her ankle and simply pull her legs down slightly. And then I'm going to say OK to this. And zoom back out. And if you want to see the difference in where she is now and where we were, do a snapshot of history snapshot of what she looks like right now. So I'm going to go ahead and do history snapshot. Actually, we don't even need to do the history snapshot. Simply select the layer mask for the smart filter and then invert it. It is an incredibly, incredibly powerful tool. It'll change the way you play. I'm going to leave this on. I'm going to do one last thing to show you two other things really quickly, and then we'll sort of like move on. I'm going to double click on Puppet Warp again, and this time I'm going to zoom into that original wrist that we actually had. So you cannot move pins. All you can do is get rid of them and then set a new pin. If you, for instance, click on this, so I'm clicking on the one that's on her wrist, and I want to move it. I don't end up moving the pin, I end up moving her wrist. So the only way to actually do that kind of work is to eliminate the pin and then put it where you wanted it to be originally if it's in the wrong spot. So to get rid of a pin, hold down the Option key and you will notice, so I've clicked on that pin, I'm hovering over it, I've got the Option key, and you will notice that you get a circle that goes actually around the pin itself. I haven't moved off the pin, I haven't moved my cursor off the pin at all. I'm going to click and drag. Actually, if I just clicked right there, you'll see it became a pair of scissors, and then the pin is gone. So that's how we just got rid of the pin. I'm going to hit Command Z to undo that to bring it back. This time I'm going to again hold the Option key down, but I'm not going to click. I'm simply going to bring my cursor away from it, still holding down the Option key, and you'll notice that that circle stays on there, but now I get a double-headed arrow. And with the double-headed arrow, you can click and drag in one direction, and what happens is the image rotates around the pin. So now you can actually reposition her hand to get more of a bend in her wrist or less of a bend in her wrist. And I'm actually going to put just a little bit less in there, and I sort of like the way that one looks a little bit better. And then again, go ahead and say okay to that. And we're off to the races. Does this make sense to everybody what's going on? Are we good on this part? Okay, so Verser, well, how did you spend all of that time teaching us how to do cutouts and all of that kind of stuff? This is why. I'm going to double click on the hand to kick back out. We're going to make a brand new version of this. So you can go ahead and turn off that smart object, turn on the figure. Again, we're going to start this whole same process over, although I am going to turn on the background this time. So the background is now on. I've still got my figure. I'm going to select my figure. I'm just going to make a brand new a brand new combined version of this. Now, I'm going to leave the little parts of the floor on there. I don't really care about that part. If the parts of the floor bother you, add a quick layer mask to the figure, and then hit the B key to get a brush, make it a little bit smaller. Make sure black is your foreground color, 100% opacity, 100% flow, and simply cover those parts so that we don't see them. And then again, I'm going to do a merge stamp version of this with the white background in it. So Command, Option, Shift, and the letter E makes another version of this. I'm going to then convert that to a smart object. And then I'm going to go into Puppet Warp. And I'm going to turn on my mesh so you can see it, and you can see the problem that we've just run into. You no longer have control independent. You cannot control. So let's try our same trick before. I'm going to go to More Points. I'm going to turn off the Show Mesh. I'm going to put a point at her arm, another one at her wrist, and then I'm going to try to move that. And that part actually moved up pretty well, but then I'm going to pin the rest of her shoulder and her head and the rest of this. And the problem that you end up running into in all of this, look what ends up happening. Because the mesh is covering the entire white background. It's moving everything. It's not moving her limbs independent. This is what's going on with the mesh. It's pushing in the whole thing. She's connected. I can't separate those two anymore. So that's why if you can knock something out, a figure or anything that you want to puppet warp, then the sky is the limit. Does this make sense to everyone, what's going on? Are we good on this part? Are there questions about this? So yeah, just another reason that, again, this whole ability to knock things out, not just because you want to necessarily put it into a different background or change the background or do some crazy composite or any of that kind of stuff. This is really just being able to move a hand inside of a composite. My God, if her hand was only a little bit higher, or if her head was only turned a little bit more to the side or whatever, it's so easy to do this if you can isolate those elements out. We good on this part? All right. You can close this guy up. We don't need it anymore. Go ahead and accept the puppet warp and then close it. You do not need to save it. Right back into the same folder that we were just in our session number 9. There is a build background exercise folder, if you can actually open that up. Inside the build background folder, there are 4 files. There is a background wall, background wall 1, a background wall 2, a concrete glossy cement, and a puppet warp figure. If you'll do me a favor, just open background 1 and 2 at the same time. This is going to be an assignment for next week. I take that back. Let me look at the assignment for this week. I may hold this off one more. Let me look at that before we go today. So, but anyway, if you can open up both those files in Photoshop. Again, because I like to work between files, this is why I do not use tabs. It just simply works better for me to have these images apart. So I did a whole series of images that I was looking at. The idea that I had in mind is that I really wanted that sort of like old, rundown, dilapidated building, something from like the 30s that had just been neglected, and half of the building was torn down and the rest of it had been rained on for years. That was my idea of background. That's a really hard thing to find. So I decided I would build my own. So the first file that you're looking at right here, this background wall number 1, is literally, there's a metro overpass on Armitage that's falling apart. And this is a picture about the size of a paperback book. So it's extremely small. The other thing that's next to it is actually a wallpaper sample. So the beauty of actually being able to do work like this is that you don't need to worry about scale. So I get free wallpaper. You can go to any wallpaper place in the world, they'll give you free samples of wallpaper. You can scan them and build all sorts of backgrounds. So that was my whole idea. That's pretty much what I wanted to do with this. In 9, so inside of 9, there's a folder called Build Background Exercise. So I decided to build these backgrounds, but the problem that I run into with this kind of stuff, and that you guys are running into as well, I'm sure, is there's all sorts of ways to try to marry these two together, and none of them ever look believable to me. So I'm going to try to show you the way that I would actually put this together. Put this together. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to put my idea was that the paint peeling should be on top of the wallpaper. It shouldn't be the other way around. So I wanted to see the wallpaper behind the sort of like the peeling paint. So that's going to be my goal in all of this. So to do this, click on the wallpaper, the peely paint background thing first, and you'll see that there's actually a curve in here that's actually causing contrast on that background. Go ahead and turn it on. It just darkens it up a little bit, gives us a little bit more to work with. Also select it, because when I bring in the wallpaper, I want it to be on top of the curve. I don't want it to be more contrasty. If anything, I would want it to be less contrasty. But at any rate, I'm going to click on then the wallpaper background to make it active. I'm going to then click on the layer number 2 that's got the wallpaper on it, drag it on top of the peely paint guy, hold down the Shift key to bring it in centered, and let go. This has now come in centered, and then I'm going to close up the original wallpaper number 2. And they're all together now in one image. I don't need to keep that part open. I just scanned this on a flatbed scanner. That's where this image ultimately came from. And again, the sample of wallpaper was probably about 8.5 by 11, roughly about the same size as a piece of writing paper. The image is not big enough to cover the entire background, and I want it to go ahead and be bigger, so I'm going to transform this before I do anything else. Command T to bring up the transform dialog box, click on the link between width and height, and then simply drag either one of them out so that the entire wallpaper part covers it, and go ahead and say OK to that. I don't need to be highly specific about it. Again, what I need right now, what I feel like right now is good. Yes? Sure. Do you have this? Do you have the images together? Okay. So all I did was, again, select the top image, Command T, bring up the transform dialog box, click on the link at the options menu between width and height. It's just a go-to always for me. People do the shift key as a shortcut. It works. This is just how I do it. But then if you hover over either the H or the W, you'll get a scrubby slider, and just click and drag to the right, and it'll make the entire image bigger. But it'll keep it in ratio. You'll see that in my case I went up to 132%, but they're both 132% because I kept that little chain link. And then again, simply click OK to that. So that's all I really needed to do with this. So the way people will try to put this together, the first thing people do is just drop the opacity. So just grab the opacity and start to pull it down. And you can see that the background starts to come through. But then it looks like the wallpaper is really the paint, and that's what's really peeling. It's not set behind that. This does not work for me. So I'm going to drag the opacity all the way back up again. The next thing people do is change the blending modes, and they change the blending modes typically to things like multiply, and you'll actually see again the background is coming through. You can see the paint, but it still looks like that the wallpaper is on top. It's the top surface of this. So that's not working for me. You can also try overlay. Now overlay is a little bit more subtle, but it's too subtle in my opinion, and it's still, I've got all sorts of wallpaper that's actually sitting on top of the paint, and that wouldn't be the way it was. In this area right up here in the top where the paint is completely gone, that part's working out really well, but then I've still got visible wallpaper that's on the top of the paint that's actually peeling. So that's not believable. So then people will try soft light. It's just a less contrastier version of it. None of these actually work for me, so I don't use any of those. Instead, what I'm going to use is a luminosity mask. And now we've done luminosity masks already in this class, but typically we're doing those using to knock out figures and to do that kind of stuff. Instead, I'm going to actually use it to actually mask this background. So I'm going to turn off the eyeball for the wallpaper so that I can actually get to just the image of the peeling paint. And I'm going to load this as a mask. I'm going to create a mask that's literally based on what this thing looks like right now. To do that, hover over the RGB channel, the composite, hold down the Command key and click. We've now loaded this as a selection. But remember, selections and channels, all masks, they're all the same thing. We have just loaded the luminosity of this. In areas of this image that are lighter, more of that has been selected. In areas that are darker, less has been selected, just the way masking works. White reveals, black conceals. Yes? I just hovered over the thumbnail for the RGB guy and held down the Command key and clicked to load it as a selection. In the channels, the RGB channel, the composite one at the very top. So again, we've done this with selections, we've done this with paths, we've done this with everything. It's no different what we're doing right here. We're going to save this, so I'm going to go up to the select menu and I'm going to come down to do save selection, and I'm going to call it paint. And say OK, Command D to deselect, and then let's go look at it. So it's at the very bottom. If you click on it, it's just a black and white version of the image that you had. If I use this as a layer mask now, all the areas that are light will actually let, again, what I've got show through. All the areas that are dark will actually hide that. So let's see what it looks like. I'm going to load the paint now as a selection. Just hover over the thumbnail, hold down the Command key and click. It loads it as a selection. And come over and turn on your wallpaper layer and add it as a layer mask. And you can see It's allowing some of that image to come through. There are parts of it that are not. But what you have to realize is that the mask that I just built, the majority of it is white, so it's letting through the majority of the wallpaper. I want the exact opposite of that. And I don't want the white areas to actually be showing the wallpaper. Like this whole peely paint up here, it shouldn't be showing that stuff. So I'm simply going to invert this mask, Command I. It turns all the areas, I'm going to hold down the Option key so you can see it. This is now what my layer mask looks like. The majority of it is now dark, which is hiding the wallpaper and letting the paint show. And the areas like up in here in the top where that really strong peely paint part was, is hiding all of the wallpaper, so that it looks like the wallpaper now is set behind all of the peeling paint. Does this make sense to everybody, what's going on here? Are we good on this part? But we don't have to stop here. Check this out. Click the layer mask that you've actually added to this. We can do all sorts of things to the layer mask. So let's say the effect is too strong. I need to actually change this part of it. I don't want, I want even less wallpaper. I can make the mask darker. So again, I've got the mask select, Command L to bring up the levels dialog box, and I'm simply going to drag this to make it darker. Look how dark I've made the layer mask. I almost don't have any wallpaper showing in it now. I'm going to undo that, and I'm going to go the opposite direction. I want more of the wallpaper to show through. So I can grab my white point slider and start to pull it back, and the more of the wallpaper starts to show through because my mask is getting lighter. Does this make sense to what we're talking about here? Are we good on this part? I'm not going to use levels on this. I'm going to cancel this out. You can actually do this much more judiciously. I'm going to zoom into this area of the peely paint part that's up at the very top right here, this part right here. There is some of the wallpaper that's actually showing up. Part of this is not right here. Part of the peely paint is actually in the paint image part of it, the stain part of it. But if I turn on other parts into here, there's some of the parts down in here that I don't really want on there. So I can hit this with a brush. If you simply hit the B key and make black your foreground color, make sure that you are working on your layer mask, you can simply paint across this part and completely remove that. The problem that I have in doing that, if you look at the layer mask itself, is that it's not following the contours of the paint at all. It's not following the luminosity of this at all. It's just a big hunk of black paint on here that's forbidding the wallpaper from showing through. But that defeats the whole purpose of what I'm trying to do here. By using a luminosity mask, I'm marrying the two together. The edges of the two work together to give me that illusion. And when I go in there and hit this with a brush like this, that does not work. So instead, I'm going to hit Command Z to undo that. And instead, there's two options that you've got to actually increase or decrease these parts right here. The first we've already used before. We've got the B key, a brush already selected. Change the blending mode of your brush to overlay. This works just like it does when we are actually trying to refine our mask. So if I want like this area right in here to be darker or lighter, in this case it's the background, it's not the peely paint. I want this to actually be lighter to show more of the wallpaper. I'm going to set my foreground color to white. And then I can simply start painting across this area in here, and you can see it's made the area lighter, but unlike a brush which would just like plow through all of that, it's kept all of the luminosity. And so now this is going to allow more of the wallpaper to show, but I still keep all of the texture of it. So I'm going to hit Command Z to undo that and show you what it looks like in real time. So again, it's this area right in here that I think is background that I want more of the wallpaper to show through, and I'm simply going to click on this, and you can see I've now got more wallpaper that's actually showing through here, but it's maintained all the contours and all the texture and everything else. Does this make sense to everybody what we're doing here? Are we good on this part? And then you can do other things like right here. I feel like, again, that this part should actually be showing more of the wallpaper, so I can continue to work on those areas in here. So that's one way of doing it. You have another option in this as well, and it's the dodge and burn tools. So if you come over to your tool palette and you come down to roughly where the gradient tool is, you'll see there's a thing under the gradient tool, looks like a drop. That's not that one, it's the one right under it. It is the dodge and the burn tool. These dodge and burn tools work on your layer mask just as well. So I'm going to actually select the dodge tool. I'm going to just turn on my mask so that you can actually see this work in real time. I'm going to leave it on midtones. Again, up in the options panel that you've got, you can target this to midtones. You can also target exposure is basically the strength of all of this. So I'm going to then dodge stuff out. I'm going to make my brush a little bit larger, and I'm simply going to start running across here. And you can see that this too is maintaining the contours and the texture of what I'm trying to actually do here. So unlike a brush that would simply obliterate all of this, it keeps all of the texture part in there. I'm going to hit Command Z to undo it and then show you again what it looks like, so that we're able to really control where this comes through and where this doesn't come through. Is this making sense to you guys? Luminosity masking changes the whole game, guys. It makes your comps believable. I'm going to double click on the hand. I'm going to go back into that very same folder, the build background exercise, and I'm going to click on the girl, the puppet warp figure. If you can go ahead and open that up. And I'm going to hide everybody else. In this case, I'm actually going to, again, it's the same one we've been working on. I'm going to do the same thing we did before. I'm going to turn off the background. I'm going to then select the figure at the very top. I just want to create a smart object of the girl by herself. So Command, Option, Shift, and the letter E to do a merge stamp version of her. I'm going to change her to a smart object. And then I'm going to drag her on top of my new built background. Hold down the Shift key so she comes centered in. And then close up the girl that I just pulled that from because I don't need her anymore. So here's my girl now in my background. But the problem that I've got with this is that she's just floating into space. I have no floor for this. So I need to build the floor for this. At this stage of the game, I need you to actually go to the pasteboard. So hit the F key once to go to the pasteboard. I've got guidelines that are showing on this that are annoying me, so I'm going to go up to the View menu and come down to Clear My Guides because I don't need those. And then I'm going to go get the last file, and the last file that was in that build background thing is this concrete glossy cement. If you can open that up into Photoshop, if you get the warnings about mismatching, don't worry about it, just go ahead and say OK. Now at this stage of the game, I'm in a problem because I'm on the pasteboard. I can't see multiple images on the pasteboard, so I've got to get temporarily out of the pasteboard. Hit the F key again to go to the black one, the F key one more time to go back, and now I've actually got the cement and the figure that I want to actually work with it. So I'm simply going to click on the cement glossy layer and drag it on top of the figure, on top of the background that I'm building. Hold down the Shift key and let go, and it's going to ask me, tell me that there's a mismatch. So this actually brings in the background, and this is basically what I've got going. I'm going to close up the cement background because I don't need that part anymore. This is a image. It's literally a cement floor that I got off the internet. But it's a picture of somebody looking straight down on the floor. This is not a floor, this is a wall. I need to make it a floor. Now we need to go to the pasteboard because this is going to be pretty extreme transform. So F key to get to the pasteboard. First things first, the girl needs to be on top of the floor. She can't be sitting, the floor cannot be on top of her. So I'm simply going to drag her up on top of the floor so that the floor is actually back behind her. I'm also going to change the floor into a smart object. This is going to be a really severe transform. And if I have to do it more than once, I want to make sure that I don't do it, that I don't destroy it. So up to the layer menu, down to smart objects, and convert this to a smart object. So my floor is now a smart object. So now I need to change the perspective of it. The reason that this looks like a wall is that there's nothing that's receding into space. So to actually do that, I'm going to use perspective transform on it. So up to the edit menu, down to transform, down to perspective, And when that happens, again, you will get transform outline that actually happens on this. The first thing I'm going to do is set the back, which would be the top point of this image. So in my case, it's these, the very top control points. I'm simply going to click on the one on the right corner, the top right corner, and I'm going to drag it out till it at least covers the width of my image. I need a floor that's going to go the entire width of my image. But you see when I do this that what ends up happening is that it actually is doing the reverse of what I hoped for. This is actually making a ceiling for me. And the reason it's making a ceiling for me is that the bottom of this is smaller, narrower, the top is wider. The only thing that could explain that would be if this was receding as a ceiling, not as a floor. But now I get to change the bottom. I'm going to click on the bottom and I'm going to start to drag out, and you need to really drag out. So you think this is enough, it's not enough. I'm going to use my spacebar command and option to temporarily get the magnifying glass and zip back out so that I get this image really small. Because I'm on the pasteboard, I've still got my control handles, and I'm going to continue to kick this thing way out. There's a massive distortion in this. In my case, well, the width on this is on the order of, I don't know, 750%. It's monstrous what's actually happening in here. I don't know if this is good enough. Again, it's really hard to see what's going on here, but I'm simply going to accept this, and if it's wrong, it's a smart object, I'll be able to change it. So I'm simply going to say okay to that. I'm going to zoom back into my image. And this is now seriously looking like a floor to me, but it's too tall. It's up in my image. So I'm going to simply hit the B key to get the move tool, and I'm going to simply drag this straight down. And all of a sudden now I have a floor. Now the distance between her feet and the horizon line determine the distance between her and the background. Now the background is relatively sharp, not really sharp, but relatively sharp, but there's too much distance. The distance between her and that background right now has got to be 10, 15 feet. To bring her closer to the wall, you simply bring your floor down more. And the more down you bring the floor, the more ultimately she becomes closer to that background wall. Does this make sense to everyone what's going on here? Okay, the last thing that I have to deal with in here is that depth of field. Again, this is back to compositing 101. In this case, because it's a man-made background, I'm putting together pieces that are all pretty much in focus and that are all pretty sharp. Once you put the background together, that couldn't really be. If the girl's sharp, the background has to be softer. Part of the foreground floor needs to be softer, and part of the background of the floor also needs to be softer. It needs to be only sharp right around her. Make sense? So the first thing I'm going to do is the background. However, my background is now made up of 3 different layers. So I need to make my background one layer to actually work with. I'm not going to add the floor to this, but I am going to add all of the other background, the wallpaper and the painted part. So I'm going to come down to the painted part, hold down the Option key and click on the eyeball. It turns everything else off. Then I'm going to add the curve on top of that, and then I'm going to finally add the wallpaper on top of that. So this is only my background, not the floor. I'm going to select the wallpaper layer because I want the merge of all of this to sit on top of it. Hold down Command, Option, Shift, and the letter E, and it will actually give me a merged version of this. I'm going to immediately turn that into a smart object because when I start to blur it, I want to be able to adjust that blur. If let's say I blur it, I print out a version, a check copy of this, it's too strong or it's not strong enough. If it's a smart object, then it'll be a smart filter and I'll be able to rechange it. So again, I'm going to convert this to a smart object. And then I'm going to turn on my figure in the background. I've still got that wall, the back wall highlighted. And I'm going to put a simple blur on it. I'm going to zoom in a little bit so I can see what I think it should look like. Up to filter, down to blur, down to Gaussian blur. And in my case, I'm going to turn off my preview. That 2 pixels seems too strong. Try like a 1.5. That's still too strong. Try like a 1. that actually seems pretty good to me. And I'm going to go ahead and say okay to that. So now I've actually created some separation between her and the background. Again, you'll still see that it's a smart filter. One of the things about smart filters is if you start to turn the eyeball of the smart filter on and off, it'll actually turn the filter on and off. But it's very, very, very graphic, heavy, processor intensive to do that. The easier, faster way is to simply invert the mask. It's really quick, and you can just turn it on and off. And you can see it's just taken the edge off of that background, so that part I'm beginning to believe. However, the next thing I need to do, though, is I need to blur the floor, and I need to create the illusion that, again, this is a depth of field movement in here. So I'm going to do the floor, and in this case, I'm going to do a really strong one so that I can see how to set my depth of field into this. So I'm going to select the floor layer, up to the filter menu, down to blur, down to Gaussian blur. And in this case, I'm really going to smack this hard. I'm going to put it like at a, well, let's put it at like a 10. I'll do like 10, 12, 15, somewhere in there. So a lot of blur in here. It's going to be too much, but I'll reset it later. And I'm going to go ahead and say okay to that. Now to create the illusion of blur, again, I could go in and paint this. I could try to paint a line right underneath her that would hide that blur, because again, I've got a smart filter mask to do this. But instead, I'm going to use the gradient tool to actually create this for me. So hit the G key or come over and simply pick on the gradient tool. In the gradient drop down, the first thing we're going to go to is I am going to open up the basic gradient. It is going to be foreground to background. So again, black to white, my foreground and background colors, that part's fine. But instead of selecting a linear gradient at the beginning, you want to, on the little icons that are at the very top, you want to move over to the right. You want to go over to the linear gradient is the first one, circular gradient is the next one, cone gradient is the next one. It's the next one over is the mirrored gradient tool. So you want to click on that one, and then you can see what it ends up looking like in your smart filter mask. So make sure that the mask is selected, and then I'm going to simply come here right by her feet, and I'm going to click and drag forward and see what I get. And you can see that this is the exact gradient that I really did want to get. Look at my mask right now. There are dark areas. Actually, this gradient is the exact opposite of what I want. It's only showing the blur right under her feet. So instead, I'm going to Command Z to undo that, and I'm going to invert my foreground and background colors. So I'm simply going to hit the X key. So now when I pull the gradient, everything is blurry on this image except for the area that's right underneath her feet. So there's an area that's actually right in here. If we zoom into this, you'll actually see it's a little too back behind her. So I'm going to pull another gradient. I'm just going to start here and continue to pull them to try to get that really blurry area behind her and also in front of her. But if you look, I'm going to actually pump up the blur even more. So I'm going to click on this blur. I'm really going to drag it up to now. I'm going to drag it up into the 30s. And now you can see where the area it's being masked is literally right underneath her feet. And then the background is much more blurry and the foreground is much more blurry. So I know that I've got my mask is in the right place. So then I simply need to open up the Gaussian blur smart filter and drop this down to something that would make sense. So probably something around, I'm just trying to match the background. I'm trying to get this tone in the back, these two to sort of match where the floor is actually meeting the wall, and I'm somewhere around a 2, feels about right. Again, use your preview check mark on and off, and that feels like that part's about right. And go ahead and say okay to that. Double click on the hand, and we are ready to rock on this. So the final thing that I would actually do here, again, you can go through, I would do my check layers on this part to make sure that things were blending. Again, let me do shadows first, and then we'll look at check layers really quickly to make sure we've got it. The thing that is missing on this clearly is shadows. So I'm going to click on the floor layer, because again, I'm putting my shadows on top of the floor, but underneath the girl. So I'm going to simply add a blank layer on top of the floor, call it shadow 1, and say okay. Hit the G key to get to the gradient tool again. Make sure black is your foreground color. In the drop-down menu now, for the type of gradient, we're not going to do foreground to background. We are going to do foreground to transparent. Again, we've already gone through this before. I just want to reiterate this again. We are also going to do a circular gradient, not a linear one. So it's the second from the left of the little icons is the circle gradient. And then I'm simply going to come out here into space, click and drag out. I get a circular gradient. Command T to bring up the transform dialog box. Hold down the Option key and click on the top control handle to compress the gradient down to flatten it. The reason I added the Option key is it actually does both the top down and the bottom one up so that the gradient compresses evenly. I'm going to click inside the box, but not on the anchor point. If you click on the anchor point, it moves the anchor point. That's not what we want to do. We simply want to click on the box to bring this underneath her feet. I'm going to zoom way in here now. I'm going to make this gradient much smaller because I'm going to go for the area that's literally the point right under her feet. So I'm going to make this considerably smaller and much more narrow and even flatter. And then I'm going to drag this part underneath her feet like that. And I'm going to go ahead and say OK to that. Hit the E key to immediately get the eraser, and we need to erase all of that shadow that's right in front of her feet. Now again, for my brush setting for eraser, I typically will, the mode is going to be a brush. I do leave the opacity at 100%, but I'm going to bring the flow down to like a 15%, whatever, and then simply scrub across this. That 17% is still too strong. Command Z to undo that. I'm going to drop the flow down even more, 5-6%. I really want to be able to control this and just to actually get that part on it. And that's my first shadow. That's the part that would be right under her feet. I'm going to do a second shadow right now. So I simply added another layer on top of my shadow number 1. I'm going to double click it and call it shadow 2. And say OK to that. G key to get the gradient tool. Click and pull it out. Command T. Hold down the Option key to actually crush this somewhat evenly. I'm going to zip back out so that I can really see sort of what's going on here. This is going to be a more intermediate shadow for her. So again, kind of for her body, but not the really sort of like long trail that's going to fade out back behind her. Again, it's a little bit too big. And that feels a little bit right there. So again, I'm trying to feel about her whole body in this part. I'm going to go ahead and say OK to that and then radically drop the opacity of this down. It would be nowhere near that dark. It's really just a kiss or sort of a hint of something down there. So it's surprising how much you can really drop these things down. But the difference that they actually make in here. So I'm down around 30-40%. That one's actually pretty good. I'm going to do one last one. So one more layer on top of that. Call it shadow 3. And say OK. G key to get the gradient tool. Click and drag down. Command T to bring up the transform. Hold down the Option key. Really compress this one. But also, I'm really going to drag this one out. So and that compress this a little bit more. The shadow would be much more narrow. And say OK to that. Hit the E key to get my eraser, get rid of all the shadow that's in the front. There could be no shadow in front of her. There's nothing to create that shadow. And then you really got to crank this transparency down. I mean, it's just basically, it's a hint, a kiss of something there. Double click on the hand and see where we're at. I think that my initial shadow is probably still a little too strong as well, the one that was right under her feet, so I just selected it and I'm going to drop the opacity of that guy as well. So finally, just because we've got the time to do it, I'm going to click on my very top layer and I'm going to run my check layers action. And I'm going to turn off my color check layer. And I'm going to start with my luminosity check layer. And when I look at this part, I feel like, again, my background is actually, my whole scene seems to be she seems to be a little bit too dark for this scene. So, but, never thought about this. Actually, I've thought about it before, but now I'm actually going to change something. Before we actually do our check layer, looking at this scene, I need to match the lighting on the scene in the same way that it actually is on her. Now, when I shot the picture of the painted background, it's basically a flat light, but the lighting on her is actually a side light. And so I need to sort of recreate that part that's actually going to, again, marry the lighting on the background closer to what the lighting on her is. So to do that, before we do any of our luminosity checking, I'm going to come down and I'm actually going to select the floor layer. So I'm going to select the floor layer and put an adjustment curve on that, because the floor layer, by selecting it, I am not only going to put a curve on, or not only impact the background wall, but it'll also impact the floor, which is how lighting would actually be on this. So to do this, this is a quick down and dirty trick that I'm going to show you guys. So I've selected the floor smart object. I am going to add just a normal curve on top of this. So I've got the normal curve on top of this, and I'm simply going to change the blending mode to multiply. So if you change it to multiply, you can see that it makes the floor darker and the background darker as well. If you need to do the reverse, again, these are just really quick tricks. Instead of doing multiply, go to screen and it'll make everything lighter. Again, and then you simply use your opacity to fine tune how much darker or lighter you want this to be. I'm going to go back to multiply because I want the sense of light. I want this to be darker on this side and lighter on this side over here. So this has made everything darker, but again, I've got a layer mask here. I'm going to then go to my gradient tool again, the G key. I'm going to change the option to go from foreground to background. I'm also going to change it to a linear gradient, not a circular gradient. And then black is my foreground color. I don't want the darkening to happen here on the right side of my image. I want it to be on the left side of my image. So I'm going to start on the right side of my image, and I'm going to click and simply drag to the left side of my image. And you can see now that it's actually made the side that's on the right lighter, but the side on the left is now darker. If you turn the curve on and off, you'll see all it's doing is it's building more weight in the darkness on this part over here. And it works pretty well. If you feel like it's not strong enough, you can actually just duplicate the curve. So I'm just going to select the curve, Command J, darkens it even more. Now if you say, okay, well, yeah, but that's too strong now, you can simply use your opacity slider to drop that part down till the point where you actually get this to feel like the image that you imagine it to be. So these are now, this is my difference in relighting the background. And it's huge. Is this making sense to you guys? Now when I do my luminosity check, she actually seems correct. She no longer seems too dark for the image. The image has now been brought down in tone. Doesn't that seem right to you guys? No, yes? And then let's check our saturation check. And you can see in the saturation check, actually her outfit is standing out considerably relative to the whole background. So I would probably bring the saturation down a little bit. So to do that, it'll be the last move that we make right now. I'm going to select the smart object that is the girl. I'm going to add a hue saturation curve to this. But again, just like all the work that we do when we're using check layers, your very first move is to clip this hue saturation layer to the girl. So I'm hovering over the where the hue saturation layer is touching the smart object, holding down the Option key to get the clipping icon. Click on it, it clips it now to the image, so it only will impact the image. But then before you do anything, change the blending mode of this from normal down to saturation, because you only want to change the saturation part of this. And then I'm going to take my master slider here and try to pull this back down. Sorry, changing the hue on this. Not what I wanted to do. Saturation, and start to pull it down. And you'll start to see as you pull it down that it starts to, the whiteness of that dress starts to actually drop down a little bit. That's what the saturation hold check is about. And then I'm going to turn off my check layer and see how I feel about this. And I'll turn this on and off. And I feel like looking at this, it's a little bit too strong of a move. I feel like I've lost too much in her face. Some people would like that. If I want to put it, if I'm happy with what it did to her skirt, or to what she's wearing, but not happy with what it is done to her face, I've got a layer mask here. Hit the B key to actually just bring up a brush. Make sure it's a normal brush. I'm going to change the flow down to like a 3, 4, 5%. Black is my foreground color. I'm going to zoom in here just a little bit, and I can start to work on just bringing back her face. Push up my flow just a little bit. And that feels like it fits a little bit better for me. If you're going to do it to her face, you need to do it to her hands as well. And that is my man-made composite. So, in terms of assignments, wow, I have totally lost track of where we're at in this class. Today is the 5th, right? So this is in session 10. So there is a smooth swimsuit. I'm going to do this. Let's hold off on the man-made composite part. I don't want to throw too much at you guys. This is typically in this class, this smooth swimsuit would be the final assignment. I'm going to go ahead and say do the smooth swimsuit, this one assignment. I'm going to say hold off on the shoot man-made composite. We will look at a man-made composite. We might do one later on, whatever. For the time being, I'm going to hold off on this one. I want you guys to spend more time working on your final project. But the smooth swimsuit is the last of the official assignments. We might just do a man-made one to give us some stuff to work on in class. Basically, this is what the assignment is. It's going to say smooth swimsuit assignment so that it roughly looks like this example right here. Just so that you know where it is, we are in week 10. So it's this one right here, inside this, the assignment folder. Again, if you look at the assignment part right here, it's the same thing. But if you look inside the swimsuit folder, there is a key in here. There's a lot of files in here. Let me give you 2 hints. There's a lot of files in here. And we just spent a lot of time working on Puppet Warp today. Those are my 2 hints. Are we good? I know I've confused the shit out of everybody now. Just wait and see. Are there any questions about any of this? Are we good? Okie dokie.